All right, we're back, and this time we're going to talk about different vegetation types, different forest types that we might see in the Sierra Nevada and other parts of California. So this is going to be pretty brief, but we'll just go through it quickly. Okay, so different California forest vegetation types. So this isn't going to include all the vegetation that we would see in California, like sagebrush vegetation and grassland vegetation and desert vegetation. This is more focusing on like the forest that we would see. So first of all, here is a kind of what could be viewed as a cross section of the Sierra Nevada mountains. So coming up on the west side, if you were driving like up Highway 80 or Highway 70, you would cross through these different types of vegetation up to the peaks, and then you would come down and see these other types of vegetation on the east side of the Sierra. So way down in the valley, we have grassland vegetation that we've all seen as we drive through it, and then that starts to be mixed in with scattered oaks. And then as we move up higher, we start to get into chaparral vegetation with like manzanita and chamise and ceanothus. And then as we go farther, we start to get into like gray pine and then ponderosa pine. And then we start to get into mixed conifer. So in Quincy, we're kind of on this boundary between like a ponderosa pine and a mixed conifer forest. And as we drive up even farther, we start to kind of lose a lot of the pines in the mixed kind of conifer mix and get into a more like white fir stand, and then a red fir stand. Red fir grows even higher in elevation than white fir. And then we can get into like a lodgepole pine stand up in kind of wet environments up at higher elevations, and then into like subalpine environments with like western white pine, white bark pine. And then the Eastern Sierra actually has very different forest communities, as we'll talk more about next week. This is because the climate on the east side is a lot drier. So they have different kinds of like Jeffrey pine stands and pinyon juniper stands and sage stands that have to do with the fact that their climate is different and their precipitation is different. So we are going to focus most of the energy in our class thinking about managing these kind of mixed conifer forests, which kind of form a lot of the timber belt of the Sierra Nevada. And as I said, are kind of the areas around Quincy. And then again, the kind of Sierra mixed conifer forest that we have near us is going to be more fir dominated as we go to the upper elevations of it, and more ponderosa pine dominated in its lower elevations. But kind of both of those areas are really considered to be part of the mixed conifer forest. And then when we get up to what's really just exclusively like red fir and white fir, then we would consider that to be a different type of forest. So all of these different vegetation types exist in these different locations because of differences in temperature and moisture that exist at these elevations. These different species have competitive advantages in the certain environments where they live. And we'll talk again more about climate next week. But these are the different kinds of forests that we might see. So the mixed conifer forest, or Sierra mixed conifer forest, is kind of defined by the five main conifer species. And so we thought about these when we did the plant ID lab last time. So those species are ponderosa pine, sugar pine, white fir, Douglas fir, incense cedar. And then in addition, black oak is a very important component of the Sierra mixed conifer forest. In the northern Sierra, we tend to find this mixed conifer existing between elevations of about 2,500 feet and 4,000 feet. In the southern Sierra, all these forest types are moved up in elevation because it's just like hotter and drier, warmer up as we get closer to the equator down there. So in that range, we would see mixed conifer forests not really starting until about 4,000 feet, and then in some cases going all the way up to close to 10,000 feet in the southern part of the state. And then, as we already said, pure stands may develop within the MCF, or mixed conifer forest. So we might have more ponderosa dominated areas in the lower elevation, incense cedar dominating in riparian corridors, and then white fir in areas that are more forested or shady or in higher elevation areas, and then Jeffrey pine, which is not one of the five main mixed conifers, but is a conifer that we see within there, and that's going to be on kind of poorer sites, so lower site quality or site class areas, or in like serpentine areas. where we have specific chemical characteristics or physical characteristics about the soil that make it more difficult for the other classic vegetation to exist there. So I just want to mention riparian is a term that means having to go with or going along streams. And so we have a lot of riparian corridors within all different types of vegetation, and riparian tends to be more densely packed with vegetation because there's lots of water there than other areas within vegetation types. And so like in the mixed conifer forest, we'd see lots of like alders and willows, these different kinds of broadleaf deciduous trees going along these riparian corridors. So that brings me to kind of the last concept I want to bring up here, which is the difference between a zonal and an azonal community. So a zonal community is a community that predominates within an elevational zone, like the mixed conifer forest dominating within the areas of about 3,000 to 4,000 feet in the northern Sierra, or the red fir forest dominating in areas of like 5,000 to 6,000 feet within the northern Sierra. And that's because, again, the temperature and moisture regimes in that elevation cause a competitive advantage for this particular species that are in that forest type. And that's different than an azonal community, and that exists on the landscape because of some sort of variable or atypical situation that doesn't exist all across that elevation band, but just within a particular spot, like a stream corridor runs through. So that creates a riparian zone, and that doesn't have to do with the elevation there. It has to do with the water that's there. Or aspen stands can occur in forests where we have really wet soil. So that would be another kind of azonal characteristic that might occur in a particular spot. But in the Sierra Nevada, we don't have whole like elevational bands of aspen or whole elevational bands of willow. Where we see those things, there's kind of an unusual landscape feature that's causing those plants to be able to grow. And in some cases, the unusual feature is what's called edaphic, which means that there's something that has to do with the soil that's causing an unusual feature, an unusual type of plants to grow in that unusual soil. And so as we mentioned before, Jeffrey pine grows on like really poor soil qualities or in serpentine stands. And so that can happen in the Sierra, within the Sierra mixed conifer forest, or chaparral. We can have more shrubby plants growing kind of within the broader mixed conifer forest in areas where there's really limited soil development, or maybe where there's been like really severe fire or disturbance history that has caused erosion and stuff, and caused shrubs to grow instead of trees in an elevational zone or band where we normally would expect to have a certain different type of plant community growing. And in some cases, like the case of Jeffrey pine or aspen, that particular plant community can be zonal in a different place in the world. So we do have big bands of Jeffrey pine in the eastern Sierra, or big elevational bands where aspen is the dominant vegetation in the Rockies, but where we see them on the west slope of the Sierra Nevada and around Quincy, it's always because of some sort of unusual or azonal feature. Okay, that's what I wanted to say. So that's a good stopping point.